We have had a student request to look at theme 4 and in particular the unit on the World Council of Churches and the Ecumenical Movement. I just want to remind you that on the sample paper there is a question that is explain the rationale and mission of the World Council of Churches. So I have deliberately chosen not to answer a question with a narrow focus on the World Council of Churches because you have got a mark scheme here that you could work into an essay of your own. There's also a part B, which is the Ecumenical Movement has failed in its objectives. If we look at the specification, you can see that it's quite bitty on religious identity through unification. You need to know the development of the ecumenical movement since 1910, and that's what my essay is going to be on. You need to know about the rationale and mission of the World Council of Churches, which is what the sample question is on. You also need to know about the work of the World Council of Churches with regards to unity, mission and ecumenical relations. If I was answering that question, I would have a paragraph on unity, a paragraph on mission and a paragraph on ecumenical relations with examples of things that the World Council of Churches has done. There's also a requirement to know about public witness and diaconia and ecumenical formation. Diaconia is a Greek word that means to serve, and so this is asking you about public witness, so evangelism, but also missionary work, so the work the World Council of Churches does to serve the communities it represents. Then, if we look at the part B's, that's either going to be on whether the work of the World Council of Churches can be viewed as a success or a failure, and the role of the Roman Catholic Church, because the Roman Catholic Church is not a member of the World Council of Churches, is going to be a big part of that answer, which then links with the second part B, which is the extent to which the non-membership of the Roman Catholic Church affects the aims of the World Council of Churches. So because that mark scheme exists, I have chosen to answer a more general question on explain the development of the ecumenical movement since 1910. I have deliberately made this answer slightly too long so that you could take from it just the information about the World Council of Churches, if that's what the question was on. But if it's a broader question on the ecumenical movement generally, equally there's going to be enough information for you. As always, I've typed this one up actually in just under half an hour because it's too long, but I've typed it up in exam conditions. There are going to be typos in there. It's not going to be perfect. I'm also filming this at home and I think you can hear my little boy in the background, so that's the strange noises. As I talk you through this, I'm going to be highlighting where I am using key terms or religious language because that's a skill the examiner is looking for. Where I've got my evidence, my sources of wisdom, and that's going to be Bible passages, but also snippets from encyclicals, and also, evidence could be the councils themselves or groups that are formed. This isn't really a scholar question, but Karl Rahner does make a sneak appearance because he's very influential on the Roman Catholic Church. And a big thing is going to be linking back to the question. So I knew this answer was going to be too long, and so there is not an introduction. The question is, explain the development of the ecumenical movement, and so I begin by talking about ecumenicalism. And so that's my linking with the question. I've also got the original Greek word that means the entire inhabited world. And so at the start of the 20th century, there was just a feeling that Christians needed to be more united. And partly this was because that is what the Bible calls for. So in John 17, and that's an important passage because John 17 is referred to over and over again by the World Council of Churches. Jesus asks that his believers are united, are one. and he makes a link between him and the Father being one, and also all Christians being one. And then furthermore, in the letter to the Corinthians, St. Paul makes a plea to that particular church that they should be more unified and that the divisions should stop. And so two key biblical sources, so from Jesus and then from St. Paul, who of course is a key figure in setting up the first churches, there's a call for unity. Now, the question here says, explain the development of the ecumenical movement since 1910. So there's no point really talking about anything before 1910. So I begin with in 1910. So in 1910, there was an international missionary conference that was held in Edinburgh. And this was a meeting of Protestant churches from Northern Europe and America. You might remember that in class we looked at pictures of this conference, and it was indeed packed with white, quite old men. And from this conference there developed three movements that would, over a period of about 40 years, feed into the World Council of Churches, which was originally founded in 1948. So the first movement, my first source of evidence, is the Faith and Order movement, which was focused on looking at doctrinal differences between the churches. That work was interrupted by the First World War, but then they met again in 1927 and 1937, and it was from that 1937 meeting that the World Council of Churches was formed, and that is just after the Second World War. And there was very much a feeling that if politicians could create something like the League of Nations so there's the League of Nations there, to act as an example of political unity, that surely Christians should be leading the way in demonstrating reconciliation between countries or churches that had very recently been at war with one another. So the World Council of Churches was founded in 1948 very much in a spirit of reconciliation, and at the start of the journey I'm guessing that Europe and America was at the focus of that, just like Europe and America were a focus of the League of Nations. So the Faith and Order movement recognised that there was diversity in practice, and I've given examples such as baptism and the Eucharist, and that this was not necessarily a bad thing. However, there were divisions, there had been tensions, and Christians needed to be mindful of those divisions and not be complacent and think that the divisions could not get bigger. And so then I link back to the question. So the Order founded a key development in the Ecumenical Movement, which is an annual prayer week for Christian unity. Then my second group that comes out of that 1910 conference is the Life and Work Movement. You will notice my paragraphs are getting shorter because I'm a bit worried about time. And this group was not focused on doctrinal matters or practices so much, but rather political and social and economic issues of the day. And there was very much a feeling that the church needed to kind of raise its game really and have more of an impact on the world. And so they needed to work together because that would increase their impact, but it would also mean that they were acting in line with those words of Jesus and St. Paul of overcoming divisions. Then the third group that comes out of this 1910 conference is the International Missionary Conference. And these don't join the World Council of Churches until the 1960s. But now, linking back to the question, I then say that this forms an important development in 20th century ecumenicalism because it starts to reach out to a much more global audience. And I contrast the 1910 Edinburgh Conference, which was white men, to this movement, which is reaching out to the newly evangelized countries, good use of key term there, in Africa, in Asia and Latin America. And this group deals with issues to do with slavery, opium addiction, so lots of issues in the countries in which they're working, as well as more general issues to do with theological education. And so now I have a sort of a summary, really, of the development that has happened. And so throughout the 20th century, the World Council of Churches has developed into a global movement. That should say global, there's a typo. And that's something that you could consider when you're asking yourself, has it been successful or not in a Part B? Because it has gone from just representing a few countries to representing much of the world. And so, for example, in the 1960s, the conference was held in India, and then later on, so this is my evidence here for that statement that it's become global, conferences have been held in Africa, New Zealand, and most recently Korea. And in addition, the presidents of the World Council of Churches act as evidence for this development in ecumenicalism. So we've had a Chinese theologian, and one of the current presidents is a patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Then in my final paragraph, I address Roman Catholic developments in ecumenicalism. So, in a space of about 40 to 50 years, the Roman Catholic Church has moved at speed. So in the 1920s, Pope Pius IX said that if we wanted Christian unity, that was great. Everybody joined the Roman Catholic Church. Not really in the spirit of ecumenicalism, that is it. And then in 1948, when the World Council of Churches was set up, the Roman Catholic Church refused to send observers, still insisting that the Roman Catholic Church was the one true church. That's your classic exclusivist view. However, at the end of the 1950s, Pope John Paul XXIII is appointed Pope. I think it's 1958, but I wasn't sure. And this marks a big shift in, well, he would count as a scholar probably, as a big shift in thought of Roman Catholic ideas about ecumenicalism. So the first thing that happens is that in 1960, Pope John XXIII meets the Archbishop of Canterbury. That hadn't happened for about 600 years, and so I make the point of saying this is a significant development. That's linking back with the question. The Pope then also appoints a secretariat to focus on ecumenical relations. And then we have the Second Vatican Council, which is going to count as a key source of wisdom that's held a few years later. And Karl Rahner, who we meet when we look at inclusivism, is a key influence on that process. And out of that council comes a document that is translated, I've got the Latin name there that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce in my Blackpool accent, but it's translated as Restoration of Unity. And so there's a piece of evidence there that the Roman Catholic Church is shifting its thought. And in that document, it no longer refers to other denominations as heretics, but rather separate brethren or separated brethren. The Church also acknowledges that during the Reformation there was fault on both sides, and also, and this is very Karl Rahner language, that other denominations had made important contributions to Christian life, whilst acknowledging that the Roman Catholic Church has a special and unique status. Then in 1965, Pope Paul VI meets the Patriarch of Constantinople. And then in 1976, the Pope meets the Archbishop of Canterbury again and sets up the Anglican Roman Catholic International Committee, which was set up to encourage relations between those two denominations.